The sea was black with silence. Above it, the sky, a pale, empty eye, watched without blinking. The ships from Athens floated like coffins on that endless water, their sails inked in mourning, their passengers chosen not for bravery, but for beauty. 7 boys, 7 girls, all unarmed, all young, all doomed. Each year, the sea remembered them. Each year, the wind carried their names to Crete, like the echo of a ritual that would never end. They were not warriors, they were offerings, and the island that awaited them had long forgotten mercy. In the heart of Crete rose a palace so vast and tangled that it seemed less a building than a spell. Knossos, a place of golden walls and whispering floors, where the corridors circled themselves like a snake eating its own tail. There, beneath the painted frescoes and feasts of kings, beneath the laughter of courtiers and the silent watch of priests, there was something deeper, something buried. It was not a prison in the ordinary sense. No bars, no guards, only stone winding endlessly inward. A maze not just of passage, but of meaning. A place built to lose things, to forget things. And in its centre, something waited. They called him the Minotaur, but he had another name once. The story begins long before Theseus took up his sword, before Athens mourned its children, before the Labyrinth had swallowed its first scream. It begins with a queen and a curse, with a white bull and a wound in the soul of a kingdom. King Minos, ruler of Crete, prayed for a sign from Poseidon. The god sent a bull so magnificent it glowed like moonlight on wet marble. It was meant for sacrifice, but Minos, entranced, kept it for himself. In punishment, the gods bent desire into a weapon. They made the queen Pasiphae fall in love with the beast, and from that union, the Minotaur was born. Half man, half bull, neither child nor animal, he was a question without an answer, a being of shame and divinity, sealed away in the twisting bowels of the earth. But the labyrinth was not made to hold a monster. It was made to hold a truth too unbearable to face. Its architect Daedalus knew this. He built not just a trap, but a map of human guilt. Each turn was a denial, each dead end a secret. The deeper one walked, the more they forgot why they had entered at all. In time, even the monster forgot who he had been. And still the tributes came. Athens, punished for rebellion, was forced to send its children to the maze. It was a political ritual, dressed in the garments of myth, a contract sealed not with ink, but with blood, and each death reaffirmed Crete's dominion, not just over a city, but over memory itself. For what is a myth, if not the story told by those in power? The Minotaur devoured flesh, yes, but more than that, he devoured meaning. He became everything that could not be spoken. Shame, war, lust, betrayal, divine punishment, and human sin. He became the beast because no one else wanted to be, and so he remained in the dark, unspoken and unseen, until a young man from Athens vowed to break the pattern. Theseus. But this is not the story of a hero's triumph. This is the story of what the labyrinth hides. Not just the beast, but the reasons for building it. The truths too dangerous to live in daylight. The palace above was for kings, the maze below was for ghosts, and each child sent to the Minotaur did not just feed a monster, they preserved an illusion. Theseus stepped ashore with the others, his face unmarked by fear, but his calm was not courage, it was fury, the kind that simmers beneath silence. The kind passed down through generations, when justice is replaced by memory, and memory by myth. His father, Aegeus, had sent him not to fight, but to die with dignity. Theseus had other plans. The other youths believed they were walking toward death. Theseus believed he was walking toward meaning. In the court of Knossos, the air shimmered with perfume and tension. Minos ruled from a throne carved with serpents, his gaze heavy with centuries of power. He spoke not of sacrifice, but of tradition, not of murder, but of order. This was how the world stayed balanced, he claimed. Athens had sinned. The tribute was justice. But beneath his robes, Minos was a man haunted by his own design. And somewhere in that gilded court, watching from behind veils and shadows, stood Ariadne, daughter of the king, sister to the beast, priestess of the ancient rites. She knew the truth. No one dared say aloud. The labyrinth was not built for the Minotaur. It was built for her family's shame. She had never seen her brother, only heard the rumours. That he bellowed like thunder, that he wept like a child, that his body was grotesque, but his eyes were human. They kept him in the dark, and kept her in the light, but both were prisoners of the same myth. Something about Theseus stirred her. Not his beauty, not his bravery, but the way he looked at the palace, like it was a lie he intended to tear down. That night, while the city feasted, she slipped him the thread, a spool of red wool spun in silence, a simple tool, older than kings, older than gods, not a weapon, but a map of return, a promise that even in a place built to forget, one could still remember the way out. They did not speak, they did not need to. Between them passed something older than language, an understanding that the monster was not the enemy. The lie was. As dawn painted the sky with ash, the youths were led down into the belly of the palace. The walls turned from marble to stone, from carved to rough, from human to inhuman. The torches grew dimmer, the air turned wet, and then the gate closed behind them. Inside, the maze breathed. Its silence was not empty, it was listening. Each footstep echoed like a heartbeat. The corridors branched and curled like veins. Every passage seemed to fold back upon itself. Time bent, space trembled. Some of the children cried. One sang to keep fear away. Theseus said nothing. His hand gripped the thread, now tied to the entrance. With each step forward, he left a line behind him, a thin red memory stretched against stone. The walls narrowed, the torch sputtered, and then from deep within the dark, a sound, not a roar, not a scream, a breath, slow, heavy, like something dreaming of blood. And then the scent hit him, old straw, salt and rot, the smell of something kept alive but never free, a prisoner's stench, not of evil, of abandonment. Theseus raised his blade. He did not yet see the creature, only the shape of something immense, shivering in the shadows. But in that moment, he understood what the labyrinth was built to do. Not to hold a monster, but to create one. He stepped forward, deeper into the scent and the silence. The thread pulsed in his fingers like a lifeline, a vein of memory in a place built to erase. Every wall around him bore the weight of concealment. Not to keep the Minotaur in, but to keep the truth out, and then he saw it. The creature was curled in shadow, vast and trembling, as if shivering from a cold that lived in its very bones. Its horns, once ivory, were dulled and cracked. Its breath rose in clouds, slow and rhythmic. But it did not charge, it did not roar, it simply stared at him, eyes wide, full of something ancient and childlike. Not rage, recognition. Theseus held his sword, but it felt useless in his hand. What blade could cut through shame? What steel could wound a myth? The creature before him was not snarling, it was waiting, and that, more than anything, made his skin crawl. The Minotaur, he realized, had never been a beast of appetite. He had been taught to devour, raised in silence, fed in sacrifice, named by others, caged not by bars but by narrative. Theseus lowered his weapon. The chamber echoed with breath, his and the Minotaur's. There were no guards, no chains, only two beings caught in the same story, staring at each other across the void of their inheritance. And then it moved, not to attack but to rise. The bull head turned, horns scraping stone. Its hooves struck the ground like drums, not charging, not fleeing, circling him, as if measuring the distance not of flesh but of memory. The Minotaur's body was scarred, not just with time but with ritual. On its side he saw patterns, paint, ash, symbols, once sacred, now desecrated, a walking altar, a living scapegoat. Theseus remembered Ariadne's eyes, the silence in them. She had given him more than thread. She had given him witness, permission to see the truth beneath the myth. He did not swing his sword, but the labyrinth shifted, stone groaned, walls breathed. Somewhere, Something was displeased. Perhaps it was the gods. Perhaps it was Minos. Perhaps it was the story itself, demanding its blood, because something in the maze would not allow both of them to leave. The Minotaur stepped closer. Theseus could hear it now. Not a growl, but a voice. Low, guttural, unformed. The attempt at speech, a sound like broken prayer. And then it lunged, not at him, but past him, toward the wall, toward the sound of shifting stone. The maze had awakened. It did not want the silence broken. It did not want a witness. The labyrinth was not just walls. It was will. It was myth defending itself. And in that instant, Theseus saw what needed to be done. Not to slay the beast, but to unmake the prison. To unravel the thread of lies, not just to escape, but to reveal. He turned and ran, not in fear, but in revelation. The Minotaur followed, hooves cracking the floor behind him, not hunting, joining. The thread unraveled behind them, red and trembling, connecting the beast and the man, the lie and the truth. The children they passed in the dark stared in awe and terror. One girl reached out and touched the Minotaur's flank. It did not flinch. It moved like memory made flesh. The exit was close, but so was collapse. The walls shook. Dust fell like ash. The maze was dying or being reborn. And Theseus knew. There was no going back, only through, only forward. Together, Theseus did not look back. The air around him swirled with dust and the heat of movement. Behind him the Minotaur ran, not as predator or prey, but as something once exiled, now returning. The red thread quivered between them, like a vein too ancient to sever, a pulse connecting past to present, myth to man. They passed alcoves of bone and half-burnt offerings, relics of rituals no one remembered performing. The labyrinth was unravelling, not collapsing, but unmasking, walls twisted, revealing their architecture. The curves were not random, the patterns not chaotic. Every turn was a symbol, every chamber a memory sealed in stone. The children followed, stumbling at first but then running, drawn not by fear but by hope. The beast had become their guide. The thing they were taught to fear had opened the path forward, and in this turning, a great inversion was beginning. Ariadne stood at the entrance. She felt it before she saw it. The change. The walls trembled like breath. The golden tiles of the palace quivered underfoot. Servants whispered. Priests clutched their icons tighter. Minos demanded answers, but none came, only silence, and from the deep, a sound no one had ever heard before. Laughter. The children were laughing. It echoed up the winding stair, strange and sacred, like water found in a desert. Then she saw them, wide-eyed, wild, still streaked with ash, but alive and unbroken, and behind them, the impossible. The Minotaur emerged, blinking in the light. He did not roar, he did not rage. He looked toward Ariadne, and for the first time in all her memory, she saw him not as myth, but as brother. He stepped forward. The priests cried sacrilege. The guards raised their blades, but Theseus stood in the doorway, thread in one hand, silence in the other. No more, he said. The words were soft, but they echoed like thunder. Minos rose from his throne, his eyes lit with the cold fire of legacy. He saw his daughter's defiance. He saw the thread still connected, and he saw the crowd, the people of Crete, gathering, watching, waiting. Myths only lived as long as the people believed in them, and for the first time, the people doubted. The labyrinth had been a mirror. Now it was broken. Minos stepped down, but not with rage, with weariness. The burden of a lie is that it must be carried forever. And in that moment, he let it fall. The silence of power cracked. The Minotaur did not kneel. He simply stood, and by standing, he changed everything. The children circled him now, unafraid. They touched his hands, traced the symbols carved into his skin. They whispered his name. Not the one history gave him, but the one no one remembered. A name without fear. Ariadne stepped forward. She placed her palm on his chest, felt the breath, the life, the heartbeat that had echoed in the dark, for so long without answer. Then she turned to Theseus. "You didn't slay the monster," she said. He shook his head. "There never was one." And that was when the labyrinth began to vanish. Not in fire, not in ruin, but in transformation. The walls dissolved like smoke, the corridors uncurled into gardens, the darkness folded into dawn, and in the place where the maze had stood, there was now only earth, soil, roots, flowers. The Minotaur stepped forward, leaving no footprints, no beast, no blood, no blade, only story. And stories are not stone, they shift, they bleed. They remember long after the world forgets. The labyrinth may have vanished from the land, but in the minds of those who walked it, it remained. A scar shaped like a spiral, a dream etched in red thread. The people of Crete stood in stunned silence. No trumpets marked the change. No edict announced the end of sacrifice. The king's power did not fall with a sword, but with a silence too large to ignore. That silence spread like a tide, and tides once turned do not retreat. Minos withdrew, not as ruler, but as relic. He vanished into the high chambers of the palace, his voice no longer law but echo. Some say he lived out his days in quiet, staring into a mirror that no longer flattered him. Others say he descended into the ruins, seeking the monster that had once served his myth. But the world had already shifted. Ariadne remained. She walked not with royalty, but with the children. She taught them new songs, ones not of tribute, but of return. Her hands carried herbs instead of blades. Her rites were not of silence, but of naming. She traced the maps of forgotten myths in sand, drawing not labyrinths, but spirals that led inward, not to monsters, but to memory. And the Minotaur, what became of him? He left the palace with the dawn. No army followed, no prison chased him. He walked out of legend, like a man waking from a long sleep. Some say he crossed the sea, others say he turned into wind, or horned constellations in the night sky. But there are those who believe he still walks among us. Quiet, tall, watching, not as a beast, but as a reminder. For the Minotaur was never a warning against monstrosity. He was a mirror of what happens when we bury the parts of ourselves we fear. Theseus returned to Athens, not in triumph, but in transformation. He carried no head, no trophy, just the thread, now frayed and stained, and the memory of a brotherhood born in the dark. His people tried to celebrate. They lit fires, prepared feasts, but he did not speak of battle. He spoke of the labyrinth, not as a place, but as a condition, a system designed to forget the humanity of what it hides. His words were not popular. Athens had wanted a hero. He returned a witness, and so his myth was rewritten. The poets gave him a sword, a slaying, a crown. They needed a victor, not a vessel. They needed the monster to stay monstrous. But Ariadne remembered. She kept the thread safe. She sang the story whole, not the official version, but the one woven in silence and breath, in eyes that met without fear. Years later, when strangers came asking about the old days, about Minos, about Theseus, about the beast, she would smile and lead them to the grove where the labyrinth once stood. There, among the trees, she would plant her stories like seeds. She never corrected them. She never argued. She simply asked them one question before they left. If you met the Minotaur yourself, would you know which one of you was the monster? Some didn't understand the question. Others couldn't forget it. It followed them home, into their temples, into their dreams. It settled in the cracks of certainty and whispered a deeper kind of truth. That the Minotaur was never caged in the labyrinth alone. We each carry our own maze, and deep within it, something unloved, something misunderstood, waits to be seen. The legend was not erased, but it was altered, quietly, like mist softening the edges of a statue. Ariadne's story, once a footnote, grew roots. It spread through the voices of women who lit candles in secret groves, of old men who remembered when kings trembled, of children who dreamed of monsters that wept. Even as new palaces were built, even as new myths were minted, the story of the labyrinth began to change. Not all were pleased. Priests protested. They painted the Minotaur in darker hues, redrew him with sharper teeth, louder growls. They warned that mercy was a weakness, that Empathy eroded the sacred order. They rebuilt shrines in the shape of cages, but the tide had turned. A new generation walked the ruins of Knossos not with torches, but with questions. Why did a god punish a queen with unnatural desire? Why was a child condemned for the sin of his parents? Why did a city choose sacrifice over healing? And always, who built the labyrinth, and for whom? Daedalus, the architect, vanished from history's pages. Some say he fled to the mountains, others say he built wings of wax and flew away. But there are whispers, soft, almost inaudible, that he returned to the ruins late at night, hands shaking, eyes wide, and walked the invisible maze he once designed, hoping to unmake what he had done. He never did, because a maze, once believed, does not need walls to exist. It lives in choices, in silence, in systems. The labyrinth was not merely a structure, it was a structure of thought, a way of organizing power through fear. It fed not just on flesh, but on obedience, on forgetting, and that, Ariadne understood, was its true danger. So she began to teach a different geometry. She spoke of spirals, patterns that returned, not to trap, but to deepen, paths that wound inward, not to confuse, but to awaken. She taught that the center of the maze was not a monster, but a mirror, and that those who dared to look would not find horror, but themselves. In Athens, Theseus grew older. The crown rested uneasily on his head. He had touched something in the dark that refused to leave him. A thread tugged at his heart, reminding him of a truth too sacred to speak in court. He ruled wisely, but distantly. Those closest to him said he often wandered the gardens at night, whispering to the wind. Some say he returned to Crete in secret, that he visited the grove where Ariadne told her stories, that he stood among the olive trees and remembered the boy he was, the thread in his hand, the breath of the creature in the dark. But whether he returned or not, one thing was certain. The story did, and stories once awakened do not sleep again. The labyrinth had fallen, but the deeper maze, the one inside us all, still turned. And somewhere, in every generation, someone finds the thread. Sometimes it's a child who asks the wrong question in a temple. Sometimes it's an old woman who sings the old songs backwards. Sometimes it's a dream, a corridor with no end, a bull that speaks in riddles, a thread that leads into your own heart. However it arrives, the thread finds those ready to carry it, not to escape the maze, but to walk it differently, to remember that a labyrinth is not a trap if you know you are in one. Ariadne aged slowly, like stone warmed by centuries of sun. Her fame never rivaled that of kings. She lived without pageants, without temples, yet those who found her grove left changed. She gave no commandments, only questions. She was not a queen. She was a weaver of myths unravelled. She taught that the beast at the centre was never the point. The point was who built the walls around it, and why. And though some still whispered the old fears, still clutched at the sharp edges of legend, something softer had begun to take root. The old rituals fell quiet. The tide of sacrifice receded. Even in distant cities where the Minotaur had only ever existed in name, people began to see their own walls more clearly. For the labyrinth was never just Crete, it was empire, it was hierarchy, it was every system that demanded a monster to justify itself. Theseus died with few mourners, not because he was unloved, but because he had faded from myth. The story outgrew him. Heroes who kill are easy to remember. Witnesses are not. His sword was buried, his name remembered only in marble, but the thread, his true legacy, remained in the hands of those who chose to follow Ariadne's spiral. The children of those children built new labyrinths, not to imprison, but to teach. They walked the curves not in fear, but in ritual. Each path became a meditation. At the centre, instead of a beast, they placed a bowl of water, a mirror, a question, and always beside it, a thread. One day, as the story goes, a traveller from across the sea arrived at the grove. She was not old, but she carried an old silence. She had walked many paths, each more twisted than the last. She had heard of Ariadne, of the monster, of the maze, but she did not come seeking truth. She came seeking herself. Ariadne welcomed her without words, led her to the spiral, placed the thread in her hand. The traveller hesitated. "What if I don't want to see what's inside?" Ariadne smiled, then walked slowly, and so she did. Each step brought memory, each curve bent her own story into a shape she had never seen before. She walked until the world disappeared, until all that remained was breath, blood, and the beat of something vast beneath her feet. At the centre she found not a mirror, but a figure, tall, horned, silent. It did not speak, it simply held out its hand. She took it and understood. The monster was never meant to be slain. It was meant to be held. The traveller wept, not in fear, but in reunion. The beast faded, the centre glowed, and when she emerged from the spiral, the sky above the grove had shifted, deepening into a blue she had never known. The thread still lay in her hand, but now she knew where to take it. The thread coiled softly in her palm, like a living thing. It did not pull, it pulsed, as if guiding not through force but memory. She walked back through the grove, each step quieter than the last. Behind her, the spiral held its silence. Before her, the world awaited. The island had changed, not in its stones or trees, but in how they were seen. The palace no longer glowed with gold, its light had dulled, its corridors still. The tourists who came seeking myth found ruins, but those who came seeking meaning found the thread waiting at the threshold, wound into baskets, etched into walls, hidden in plain sight. The traveller moved through the land, like a shadow of old knowledge. She found others, women tending to stories like gardens, old men who recited riddles instead of prayers. They all carried fragments of the same story, buried under centuries of distortion. She listened, and she wove, not tapestries, not myths, but meetings, quiet gatherings in moonlit corners, where people came not to learn the story, but to remember it, to retell it not as dogma, but as echo, and with each retelling, something healed. The beast softened, the thread stretched farther. In a city far from Crete, across sea and empire, a boy wandered the back corridors of a temple. His mother had told him tales of the Minotaur, the devourer, the damned, the doom of Athens. But that day he found a different version, painted on an old ceramic pot, half buried in the dust of an abandoned storeroom. It showed not a fight, but a dance. The bull and the man circled one another, not with swords, but with symmetry. Above them, a woman stood holding a thread, like a constellation. The boy stared for hours, unblinking. Something in him moved. The next day he returned with ink and parchment. He copied the image, carried it like a secret, showed it to no one, but dreamed of it every night. In his dreams the labyrinth was not stone, but song. Each wall a verse, each corner a choice, and at its centre, always, the bull, waiting, not for death but for recognition. Elsewhere, a scholar deciphered an old manuscript said to be the lost work of Daedalus. It contained no diagrams, no plans, only fragments of thought, reflections on guilt, design, and the architecture of forgetting. One line stood out: "That which cannot be named will be buried, that which is buried becomes sacred." She closed the book and wept. Not from grief, from understanding. The traveller heard of these events like wind hears of storms. She smiled without knowing why. The thread was moving on its own now, passed hand to hand, voice to voice, beneath the surface of cities and scrolls. Not a revolution, a remembering. But every remembering comes with resistance. There were those who feared the thread, who called it heresy, who said the monster must remain monstrous for order to hold. They redrew the old myths in darker ink, louder language, sharper contrast. They turned the labyrinth into law, the spiral into sin, but they were too late. The story had already been planted. It grew in the cracks of empire, in the quiet questions of children, in the tremble of candles, lit not for fear, but for truth. It grew without permission, without design. It grew because it had to, because something long buried had begun to wake. It woke not in violence, but in vision. in dreams that did not vanish with morning light, in gestures that echoed rituals long forgotten. The world did not shake, but perception did, and that was enough. In a quiet town carved into a hillside, a sculptor began to shape bulls from clay, not fearsome, not grotesque, gentle, solemn. He didn't know why, his hands simply moved. When asked, he said they came to him in silence. He placed them on windowsills and rooftops, offerings without altars. In the capital, a lawmaker stumbled upon a folk tale in the margins of a taxation scroll. It told of a horned figure who spoke only truth and led the lost from their suffering, not through punishment, but through compassion. The story had no title, only a symbol, a spiral carved in ash. Elsewhere, a girl in a city of glass and steel found an old thread in her grandmother's sewing box. Red wool, impossibly soft. She tied it around her wrist. That night, she dreamed of corridors that led into her own chest, and a voice whispering, "You are not too much. You were never too much." The world was remembering itself, but remembrance is not peace. The stories began to clash. The official texts, with their clean divisions, their heroes and monsters, found themselves questioned. Why did Theseus kill the Minotaur? Why was the beast never named? Why were children offered as penance? Who benefits from forgetting? Temples recoiled, schools resisted. The keepers of old myths raised their voices, claiming blasphemy. They warned of chaos, of collapse, of the danger in blurring lines between the divine and the abominable. But even they began to feel it, that quiet, inexorable shift, because the labyrinth had never truly vanished. It had only changed shape, no longer stone. It now lived in institutions, in unspoken rules, in histories written by the victors. It pulsed beneath the surface of polite society, its turns disguised as bureaucracy, its centre hidden in plain sight, and just like before, it demanded sacrifice, not of bodies, but of truths. Each time someone was silenced for telling the wrong story, the maze tightened. Each time a child was taught to fear the parts of themselves that didn't fit, the corridors grew longer. Each time pain was called disorder, or shame mistaken for morality, the Minotaur's shadow deepened. But this time, there was a difference. The thread had already been passed. People began to walk the maze not in ignorance, but in ritual. They moved through its illusions with thread in hand, naming each wall, each curve, each deception. They called it by its true name, inheritance. And what is inherited, they said, can also be transformed. A writer penned a play in which the Minotaur speaks only in poetry and teaches the children to leave footprints of gold behind them. A teacher replaced the story of the slaying with the story of the meeting. A child asked her parents why anyone would ever choose to be a king if it meant hurting someone they loved. These were not rebellions, they were recoveries, reclaimings, and in their quiet way, they undid centuries of forgetting. The traveller, now older, walked again to the grove. The spiral was worn, but still present. She knelt at its edge and placed her thread at the centre, not as an ending, but as an offering. The wind picked it up. It danced like flame and vanished, because the thread was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be passed, and so it moved, not in straight lines, but in arcs and echoes, not through doctrine, but through memory. The thread became language, the thread became gesture, the thread became questions that would not stay quiet. In a library older than the nation that housed it, a scholar opened a forgotten folio. The margins were filled with notes, in 3 different hands, each writing back to the last like voices trapped in time. They weren't debating, they were remembering together, tracing meaning across generations, like fingers on a thread. The scholar wept, not for grief, but for recognition. She had spent her life trying to decode a myth that had been rewritten too many times to count, but here, in the margins, she found the truth intact, not whole, but alive. A beast who was not a villain, a girl who was not abandoned, a thread that was not a trick but a tool. Elsewhere, a dancer choreographed a piece called Labyrinth. It began with rigid movements, sharp turns, and closed fists, but slowly the body curved, unfolded, softened. By the end, the dancer stood still, hands open, thread coiled between her fingers. The audience did not applaud. They held their breath, because something in them had shifted. Even now the thread continues, passed between artists, mystics, exiles, children who see with ancient eyes. It shows up in strange places, a mural in a subway tunnel, a poem scrawled on a bathroom wall, a lullaby hummed without knowing where it came from. The labyrinth lives on, but it no longer traps, it teaches. And at the heart of this teaching, one truth remains. The Minotaur was never the problem. He was the prophecy, the mirror held up to a world afraid to face its own shadow. Those who still cling to the old myth that monsters must be slain and heroes must be crowned find themselves adrift. Their swords rust, their thrones crack, their voices echo in empty halls, because power built on forgetting cannot survive remembering. Ariadne's legacy is not in stone or scroll. It is in softness that refuses to be erased, in spirals walked barefoot, in threads held by trembling hands. Some say the Minotaur still appears, to those who are ready, not as punishment, as companion. He leads them not into fear, but through it, into the deep chambers of themselves, the parts they were told to banish. He does not speak, he does not need to. His presence says, "You are not what they said you are not a mistake." And for many, that is the first time they have truly felt free. Back in the grove, the spiral has grown wild. Flowers bloom along its path, some never named by botanists. The stones hum at dusk. People arrive with no explanation, drawn by dreams they cannot shake. Some walk in silence, some bring songs. All leave different, because the center is not the end. It is the opening, the undoing, the beginning of a new myth not yet written, but already remembered. And somewhere, perhaps far away, a child sits with a red thread in her hands. She doesn't know what it is, only that it feels familiar. She ties it around her wrist, just as someone else once did, in another time, in another telling. She closes her eyes and listens. The story is not over. The spiral continues. Each generation returns to it, sometimes knowingly, sometimes by accident. They stumble into old symbols, forgotten songs, flickers of dreams that feel older than language. Something inside them recognizes the pattern, though they cannot name it. That is how myth works, not as memory, as instinct. In a city built on rectangles, a child with a crooked heart drew circles in the dust of the schoolyard. When asked what she was doing, she said, "Trying to find the middle." No one taught her that, no one needed to. The spiral lives in the blood, in the bone. It waits for silence, then speaks. And what it says is simple. Nothing is born monstrous. Monsters are made in silence, in shame, in the corners of stories where no light is allowed. The Minotaur was never the danger. The danger was the forgetting. The child grew. She became a writer. Her stories were strange. They had no heroes, no villains, only people who tried to understand each other across impossible distances. Critics found her work unsettling. Her readers wept without knowing why. She never wrote about the Minotaur, but he was always there. Meanwhile, in another corner of the world, a prison was built in the shape of a square, but the guards walked it in circles. Inmates began to whisper of dreams, labyrinths, threads, horns that wept instead of pierced. One man carved a spiral into his wall, another found it the next day and carved another beside it. No one told them to stop, and something changed. The guards walked slower, the silences grew deeper, and at night the prisoners began to hum a melody they all somehow knew, though none remembered learning it. A song with no words, only rhythm, like hoofbeats on stone. The spiral was stirring. A teacher in the mountains taught her students that myths are not lessons, they are mirrors, that what we call myth is simply the earth dreaming through us. She never mentioned the labyrinth, but every year she led them through the forest in winding paths until they reached a clearing shaped like a spiral. At the centre, they sat in silence. Then they left small gifts, stones, feathers, handwritten fears, and walked back without speaking. None of them forgot, because once the spiral touches you, you cannot go back to the straight line. In this way, the story rippled, no longer confined to the old texts, no longer frozen in statues or simplified in sermons. It moved beneath the surface like groundwater, invisible, essential, shaping everything. And then one day, it resurfaced. A new myth emerged, not written by one, but by many. Not with pen and ink, but with living. It told of a world where beasts are not slain, but listened to, where mazes are not prisons, but invitations, where the thread is not a way out, but a way in. This myth did not erase the old, it transfigured it. It did not say, the Minotaur was good, it said, he was never understood, and that was enough to unmake centuries of forgetting. Somewhere, the traveller stood once more at the edge of the spiral, her hair now white, her voice barely breath. She watched a new child take the thread, curious, fearless, kind, and as the child stepped into the first curve, the old woman whispered, "This is not a story about monsters. It never was. It is a story about distortion, about the consequences of casting what we fear outside of ourselves, about the cost of building myths on the bones of the misunderstood." The Minotaur was not a warning to be feared, but a question to be answered. And the answer was never found in slaying, only in seeing. Across centuries, the labyrinth took many forms: prisons, palaces, classrooms, churches, places where power insisted on order, and order demanded forgetting. But beneath them all, the spiral remained, ancient, patient, unbroken. It called not to the righteous, but to the wounded. The girl with the thread, new to the spiral, still barefoot in the grass, stepped carefully. Each curve revealed something old inside her, a memory not her own, a voice, a shadow, a silence she had mistaken for safety. She walked slowly, not to reach the centre, but to meet what waited there. And what waited was not a beast, it was a mirror made of breath. And in that mirror, she saw not one self, but many. The angry child, the silent teenager, the woman who had never spoken her full truth. They stood around her like forgotten gods, not to punish, but to return. This was the Minotaur's gift, to remind us of the selves we abandon. Elsewhere, in a university cloaked in ivy and arrogance, a young professor stood before her class and erased the word monster from the board. She replaced it with projection. Her students blinked. One raised a hand and asked, "Then who was the Minotaur really?" She smiled and said, "The part of us we aren't ready to love yet." No one laughed, because they all understood, not logically, not intellectually, but somatically, in the gut, in the blood, in the strange sensation of a maze awakening inside their ribs. That evening, one of those students drew a spiral in their notebook and, without knowing why, whispered, "I forgive you." In the world of ceremony, a healer placed horns on her altar, not to summon fear, but memory. She lit incense and told the story backward. A labyrinth turning into vines, a thread into wind, a monster into a man, into a myth, into a symbol, into a seed. A seed buried in the psyche of civilization. And now, sprouting, the monster has returned, yes, but not to haunt us, to harvest, to ask, "What did you do with the truth I gave you?" There are no correct answers, only honest ones. And honesty, real honesty, is the only offering the Minotaur ever wanted. Not blood, not obedience, just a willingness to look, truly look, at the face in the mirror and say, "You are still mine, even now, even broken, even changed, even feared, especially feared, because what we fear most is never what's outside the maze, it's what waits at the centre, and what waits at the centre is always, in some form, ourselves." And so, the girl reached the spiral's heart and sat beside the bowl of water. Her reflection trembled but did not break. She saw the face of the Minotaur behind her, not looming, not menacing, just present, just watching. She turned, he nodded, and she smiled. There was no need to speak, because she knew now what Ariadne had once whispered to Theseus beneath a dark Cretan sky. The way out is the way in. And this perhaps was the riddle at the heart of every myth. That escape was never the goal, that the labyrinth was not built to imprison the beast, but to reveal the one within us. The girl stood from the bowl, thread still around her wrist. She did not trace her steps back. The spiral turned her forward, and with each step outward, she carried something from the centre. Not a secret, not a truth, but a presence. The Minotaur had not disappeared. He walked beside her, silent, steady, not as burden, not as guardian, as witness. In the world beyond the grove, time flowed differently. Systems churned, empires digitized their mazes. Forgetting became policy, remembering, a subversion, but the spiral persisted. It threaded through art, through protest, through lullabies and subcultures and soft resistance, and always the same question returned. Who built the labyrinth, and why are we still in it? A street artist painted the Minotaur not behind bars, but behind glass. His eyes were wide, almost human. The inscription beneath read, "Caged by story." The mural was defaced within a week, repainted in a day, replicated across cities by hands the artist never met. The image had become a sigil, the thread had become a signal. In the margins of institutions, in the shadows of cathedrals, in the quiet rebellions of the wounded and the wise, the myth lived on, not in its old form, but in metamorphosis. No longer a tale to be recited, but a pattern to be inhabited. The Minotaur was no longer feared. He was followed, but not as a leader, as a fellow walker of the spiral. In her final days, Ariadne, if such a name still belonged to her, was said to have written one last story. It was not found in books, but in footprints across sacred ground. It told of a world in which monsters became mentors, in which the thread was given freely to all who sought not victory, but wholeness. She was not buried, she was returned, to the spiral, to the soil, to the myth that never belonged to her alone. And in that same sacred place, generations later, the girl, now grown, stood before a gathering of children. She held no staff, no scripture, only a bowl of water, a spool of red thread, and her silence. The children knew what to do. They stepped into the spiral one by one as dusk fell. Some laughed, some wept, some held hands with shadows no one else could see. And when they reached the centre, they knelt, not to worship but to witness, because by then they understood. The monster is not what waits at the centre. The monster is the name we give to that which we do not yet understand. And the Minotaur, he never asked to be feared, he asked to be seen, and in that seeing something ancient and tender returned to the world, something lost for centuries, something silenced by sword and sermon, finally spoken again in 1,000 small voices. It was not prophecy, it was permission to be whole, to be more than one thing, to walk the spiral not to escape, but to arrive. And in the wind that moved through the olive trees that night, a voice, older than history, whispered, "You are not broken, you are becoming." But what does it mean to become when all the names you've worn dissolve like mist? When the monster, the hero, the victim, the witness, collapse into one trembling form, walking the spiral not toward an answer, but toward surrender. Becoming is not transformation, it is remembering. And what the world had forgotten, what it tried to bury under temples and textbooks, beneath centuries of violence masquerading as virtue, was that the Minotaur was not born in a labyrinth. He was placed there by men who could not bear ambiguity, by cities that demanded stories, where monsters are simple and violence is sacred. But he was neither. He was a child, born of a queen's desire and a god's cruelty, raised in shadows, given no name, fed the shame of others until he grew horns just to survive. They called him monster, so they would not have to call him kin. And it worked, for a while, until the story cracked, until the spiral returned, and with it, a paradox. that the labyrinth was not the prison. It was the sanctuary, the one place where the Minotaur could exist without having to pretend to be anything else, where he could rage and mourn and wait, not for rescue, but for recognition. But when Theseus came with his thread and his blade, he didn't just kill the creature, he killed the sanctuary, and what followed, empire, hierarchy, silence, was not order, it was amnesia, a forgetting so deep it became culture, a forgetting so absolute that when the thread returned, most no longer remembered why it mattered. They saw only a myth, a metaphor that had once been a life, but not all forgot. Some remembered differently, in dreams, in scars, in the pull of stories that never made sense until they were walked backwards. In the ache that could not be named but was always there, in the chest, in the gut, in the moments before sleep. The ache of the unwelcomed self. And now, finally, that ache had a voice again. It spoke not in words but in turning, in spirals traced by feet, by breath, by generations of seekers who dared to ask, what if the monster never needed to be slain? What if he only needed to be heard? The answer was never written, it had to be felt, and so the grown girl, now keeper of the thread, bearer of the mirror, knelt once more in the centre of the labyrinth. She had returned not to teach, not to lead, but to listen, and what she heard shook her. A voice not hers, not the Minotaur's, but something older than both. A voice from the stones themselves. From the soil that remembered every footstep, every sacrifice, every story twisted into a weapon. The voice said, "You were wrong about the monster," and she wept, not from shame, but from awe, because the final twist of the spiral was this: the Minotaur was not waiting for her. She was waiting for him, waiting to become the part of herself she had cast into shadow, waiting to hold what she had been told to hate, waiting to remember that she too was placed in the labyrinth, and that every wall she had walked was built by fear, not her own. And in that remembering, she was free, not in the way stories usually promise freedom. There were no trumpets, no triumph, no applause, just breath, just space, just the sacred stillness that arrives when nothing more must be denied. She walked out of the labyrinth, not as hero or healer, not as victim or guide, but as witness to the truth that had always been there, waiting in the dark. The Minotaur did not follow. He did not need to, because she no longer carried him as burden. She carried him as part of herself. The horns, the silence, the rage, the tenderness buried beneath it all. And she understood at last, the labyrinth was not meant to contain the beast. It was meant to cradle the becoming. She returned to her village, said little, changed nothing visibly, but the air around her was different. People stood straighter near her, spoke more softly. Children watched her with the kind of curiosity reserved for those who have been to the edge and returned with a different light in their eyes. They asked no questions, and yet they knew the myth had changed again. It would continue to change, as all true stories do, but now it was no longer a tale of conquest, no longer a tale of exile. It was a tale of return, of making peace with the parts we banish, of naming the monster not to destroy him, but to welcome him back. And across the world, the spiral spread. It moved not through screens or headlines, but through breath, through song, through quiet shifts in how we speak of pain, through how we hold each other in grief, through how we learn to see again, not with the eyes, but with the soul's memory. In a prison cell, a man forgave himself. In a church, someone lit a candle for the monster. In a bedroom, a child whispered to the darkness, "I know you're just scared." Each act was a thread, each thread a step, and at the centre of it all the Minotaur rested, not slain, not redeemed, simply witnessed. That was enough, that was everything, because the most radical act of all is to see clearly what you were told to fear and to love it anyway. So if you find yourself lost, if the corridors seem endless and the walls whisper lies, if you hear hooves behind you in the dark, stop, breathe, place your hand on the wall, and remember, you're not being hunted, you're being called home. The labyrinth was never a trap. It was an invitation to face yourself, to hold your shadow, to walk the spiral and find at its deepest point. Not a monster, but a mirror. And when you do, know this: you have not failed, you have arrived, you are not broken, you are becoming. Thank you for walking the spiral with me and for witnessing the story of the Minotaur, not as legend, but as living memory. These myths survive not through repetition, but through transformation. If you felt something stir in you, if the labyrinth now whispers your name, I invite you to stay, to follow the next thread, to walk the next path. Thank you for your time, your breath, and your presence. Until the next story, be gentle with your monsters.